morning at verses 1 through 10. And for the past 2 weeks, we've been looking at the way that different theological systems and different eschatological systems handle this passage. We talked about amillennialism, which basically means that there is no millennium other than what we're going through right now. It starts at the cross of Christ and goes to the return of Christ and says the period that we're now living in, which we usually refer to as the church age, is the millennial kingdom. Christ there's two different views. He's either ruling over the hearts of saints that are in heaven, or he's ruling over the hearts of those who believe him on the earth. So not only is the millennium during this period of time, but the tribulation is as well. Postmillennialism is very similar to amillennialism. You remember the diagrams that we showed over the last 2 weeks. The biggest difference being what, as far as postmillennialism goes?
Wasn't it that the golden years and the tribulation years were two different separate things?
Well, it's more that when you start saying the golden years, that's the biggest difference. They believe that the gospel is powerful enough where it's going to Christianize the world during this period of time, and then we have this 1,000-year golden age before Christ returns. Remember, all three of these terms that we're using, amill, postmill, premill, describe the return of Christ in relationship to the millennium. So again, postmill, very similar to amill. They're just much more optimistic about the spread of the gospel and the way that that's going to Christianize the world, resulting in this golden age before Christ comes back. Premillennialism, of course, Christ returns first and then rules over the earth for 1,000 years. So we have a very distinct tribulation period, as Kevin said, that we've been studying about in the book of Revelation. Christ comes back at the end of that period and then rules on the earth for 1,000 years. Now, it seems very clear, just as a straightforward reading, if you start in Revelation chapter 19, verse 11, and read through 20, verse 10, Christ comes back first and at the end of 19, right? And then he rules for 1,000 years in 20. Well, as long as 19 precedes 20, it seems like you'd have to be premillennial, right? Mm-hmm. So how do amills and postmills handle that difficulty for their system? I think I've hinted at that a little bit along the way, but does anybody have any idea? Anybody familiar with the system?
Is it that you said that they say that Revelation's covering the same thing multiple times from different perspectives?
Exactly. So that same period of time that we're talking about, from the cross of Christ, where Satan was bound, they would argue, until the return of Christ, that's what the book of Revelation is covering in what they call parallel sections. And I'm actually going to read you a quote from a representative of this group that embraces that. His name is Anthony Hoekema, and he's in that book that I recommended last week, The Meaning of the Millennium. I really would encourage you to get that book. I sent out links for several of those books that I recommended last week. If you just pick one to get that one, because you'll get the perspective of each one of these theological positions, and then you'll get responses from each of the other ones. And it's even helpful for a critique of our position. But as far as the structure of the book of Revelation, I want to quote Hoekema from that book. According to this view, and he's talking about the amillennial view, and particularly the dividing up of the book of Revelation into 7 sections that run parallel to each other and that really are describing the same period of time. The book of Revelation consists of these 7 sections which run parallel to each other, each of which depicts the church and the world from the time of Christ's first coming to the time of his second. And I would say more specifically from the time of his cross work to the time of his second coming. Now, if we grant, he continues, that the book of Revelation depicts the struggle between Christ and his church on the one hand and the enemies of Christ and his church on the other, and there you can see the different perspectives there, we may say that the first half of the book, chapters 1 through 11, describes the struggle on earth, picturing the church as it is persecuted by the world. The second half of the book, however, chapters 12 through 22, gives us the deeper spiritual background of this struggle, describing the persecution of the church by the dragon, who is Satan, and his helpers. Now, again, if you read him in and read that article, that section of the book more thoroughly, you actually see 7 sections that the book is divided up into, but these 2 major ones, these 2 halves. In the light of this analysis, we see how the last section of the book, and that's the one that we're about to enter into, 20 through 22, falls into place. This last section describes the judgment which falls on Satan and his final doom. Since Satan is the supreme opponent of Christ, it stands to reason that his doom should be narrated last. But in essence, what this does is allow them to start over in chapter 20. So that's why I made the point that I did. For them, yes, the return of Christ is in the end of 19, but in chapter 20, they're starting over. And they're seeing chapter 20 through 22 describing the defeat of Satan at the cross, and then the ultimate new heavens and new earth in chapter 21 especially, first part of chapter 22. This also allows them to see the first resurrection that's mentioned in chapter 20 that we'll look at this morning as a spiritual resurrection. That is, it's the resurrection of our being given spiritual life in Christ, and then only the second resurrection being a physical resurrection. And for them, that second physical resurrection is of all people. It's not just of believers, but it's of everybody. And God judges both believers and unbelievers at that point in time. Now, by contrast, pre-mills see the judgments of the 7-seal scroll, and particularly these last 8 scenes that we're looking at now in John's closing visions, as sequential. It's not the same period of time, but it's one right after the other. Now, we've been studying this for the last several months. We know that we have intercalations in between the seals and the bowls and the judgments, and that gives us background and forecast of what's going to happen. But by and large, the book is driven in a sequential and chronological sequence. And I want to make the case for this, especially with these last 8 scenes that we're looking at, because I think it's, if we're right about this, then again, you have to be premillennial, right? Because clearly, Christ comes in the end of 19 before he rules over the earth, and it is over the earth. It's not in heaven. That's clear as well. And so what I want to do is look at these 8 scenes and see if we can make a strong case for them being chronological in sequence. You see them up there on the screen. We've only looked at the first 3 so far. Christ's return as a warrior king, the invitation to the birds of prey to get them ready for this great slaughter that's going to take place when Christ defeats his enemies, the defeat of both the false Christ and the false prophets, the 2 beasts. Today we'll look at the binding of Satan and the millennium and the defeat of Satan. Then there's the placement of the great white throne, the judgment of those whose names are missing from the book of life, and then the new heavens and new earth, the eternal state. I mean, it seems on the one hand, as you look through those, that they are in a straightforward reading sequential book. Let me give you some reasons why. First, the return of Christ must happen first, or else the invitation to the birds of prey is meaningless, right? He's going to come and defeat these armies that are aligned against him in order to prepare the feast for the birds. The invitation to the birds must occur before the defeat of the beast and his armies in order for the birds to be present and to enjoy their feast when the slaughter occurs. The binding of Satan must transpire before the millennium, and his release must occur at the end of the millennium in order to account for his inactivity during the millennium. We'll talk about that more this morning as well. All the first 5 scenes that you see listed up on the screen must take place before the appearance of the great white throne, because all those take place in this present earth and present heavens, and those disappear when the great white throne comes on the scene. The great white throne must be set in place before it can be a scene for judging those absent from the book of life. The punishment of those who are absent from the book of life must come before the new heaven and the new earth in order to be able to explain the absence of evil during the new heaven and new earth. Now, it's true that the wicked, the unrighteous, those who have rejected God and his gospel are in the lake of fire, and that's in a separate place, but the new heavens and new earth is not tainted by sin. The millennium and its associated events obviously precede the great white throne because they pertain to the present creation, which disappears when the great white throne appears on the scene. And then lastly, more broadly speaking, The second coming of Christ is clearly the earliest of scenes in the fulfillment of all these 8 scenes, with a new creation coming conspicuously at the last. So, I don't think it's hard at all to conclude that these are sequential and chronological in order, and that they're not looking at the same period of time from different perspectives.
Right.
Yes?
Is there anything in what you just described that they would disagree with, though? Because did you establish that 19 was before 20, or did you just establish sequences within 19 and within 20?
I just established sequence within 19 and 20.
And they wouldn't disagree with that, right?
I don't know. I don't know what their interaction would be with this. I think they would disagree necessarily that 19. I don't know if they would see 19:11 through 16. I assume they would see that as Christ's second coming, right? So for them, they have to start over at the beginning of 20 to talk about Christ's first coming. So I do think they would disagree with sequence the way that I've laid it out.
Even within 19?
Yes, 19 and 20. I see your point. I mean, I think a lot of this, they could have a different understanding of what I'm laying out for and still see it as one after the other, but they have to say that 19 ends and 20 starts over, looking at the same period of time from cross to...
Yeah, that's the part I understood, but what you just described didn't necessarily say 19 was before 20. It was just within 19 and within 20.
Well, 19 being the return of Christ that we would see as his second coming, and 20 being what follows after that. For them, they would say that 20, well, again, I think they would agree that 19 does end that section, and it is the second coming of Christ, but 20 starts back over. It's not continuous after his return. You know, I said this before, to me the best thing to do is ignore the chapter break, start at 19:11 and read straight through. Chapter breaks are not inspired. They were given to us to be able to find passages and verses. If you do that, to me, I think the sequence is clear. So, I think it's been helpful for us to look at these different systems before we look at the text itself. That's what we're going to do this morning. And keep in mind as we read now 21 through 10, that to remember the events that we already covered back in 19, that would be 3 weeks ago. Again, they're up here on the screen. Christ's return as warrior king in 19 verse 11 and following, the invitation to the birds of prey, and the defeat of the beast. That's what we've covered up to now. Now we're going to look at these 2 scenes, the binding of Satan in the first 3 verses, and the millennium and the defeat of Satan in verses 4 through 10. But let's start at Revelation 20, beginning in verse 1. And I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the abyss, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that it should not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things he must be released for a short time. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus, and because of the word of God, even those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received the mark upon his forehead and upon their hand. And they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison, and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So as we said, we'll be looking at the 4th and 5th scenes this morning, the binding of Satan and the final defeat of Satan and the millennium. Let's look first at the binding of Satan, verses 1 through 3. We see that John sees an angel coming down out of heaven. The angel has both a chain and the key to the abyss, and he lays hold of God's long-standing enemy. He's described here the same way he was back in chapter 12, which is really where we first met Satan in the book of Revelation. He's called the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan. So 4 different terms there. Dragon is first. Remember in chapter 12, he was the one that was laying in wait to devour the male child, which is the Messiah, as soon as he was born. So a dragon is really appropriate. We don't think of a dragon as a pet or a house animal. It's really just a large serpent. He's going to be called a serpent as well. And you remember, he's just depicted as a red, fiery red dragon that's very ferocious. And that's an appropriate picture for the enemy of God. He is also called the serpent of old, which is a reference back to the form that Satan took in the book of Genesis, when he first tempted Eve, and when both Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit and plunged the entire human race into sin. He's called the devil. The Greek word is diablos. Do you might know what that word means? We think of a devil as somebody with a tail and red and horns, but it actually means one who slanders or falsely accuses. That too, if we go back to chapter 12, verse 10, John says, I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the authority of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren, and again, that's the devil, has been thrown down, who accuses them before our God day and night. It's kind of the end of the beginning, right? Remember when we talked about that chapter, we talked about the fact that Satan realizes that his time is running out. He's been very actively opposing God during the tribulation period. He's been using the false Christ and the false prophet to turn people away from the true God. And now he realizes that his time is short, and he's been forbidden from access to heaven, and he's going to vent his wrath fully on the people on earth. Finally, he's called Satan, and that word means adversary. He's, again, ultimate adversary, both of God and of God's people, has been from the very beginning, and now finally, here in the closing chapters of Revelation, this adversary is being dealt with. Now, the language here emphasizes Satan's complete incapacitation during this period. Remember, I talked about how amillennialism would see this passage at the very beginning of chapter 20 as Satan's defeat at the cross of Christ. And they would argue he's bound, but not completely bound. His activity is curbed, and particularly he can't deceive the nations the way that he used to, because now we have the gospel. Now we have Christ not only dying for sin, but also being resurrected, and that can go out to all the nations. So Satan is greatly diminished, and he has less ability now than he did before the cross. Well, one weakness with that is Satan is always subject to God, right? He even had to go to God to ask permission to do what he did to Job. And further, it just doesn't fit the language here. This is a complete incapacitation of Satan during this future 1,000-year period. Paul calls him now, as far as his activity now during this age, Paul calls him the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience. And I think we'd all agree that right now Christians are in the minority in the worldwide population, always have been. So you've got Satan working an awful lot throughout the sons of disobedience throughout the world. Well,
do they think the 1,000 years that he's bound is literal?
No.
So they think he's not bound now?
Well, we would be in the 1,000 years currently.
That's right. So
Is the 1,000 year start? Does it not start at?
Christ's death till-
started at the cross of Christ. So obviously it can't be literal, because we've already had more than 1,000 years since
If they
then.
don't, if they think it's 1,000 years, we would have to, he'd somehow be unbound now.
No, they don't believe it's 1,000. They don't believe that literally. They think it's a figurative, long
Okay,
period
so
of
they don't.
time.
They don't believe it.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, post-mills believe, at least some of them, that the power of the gospel will bring in a period of 1,000 years before Christ returns. But amills, again, the name indicates they don't believe in a millennium other than what's taking place right now, and they don't believe it's a literal 1,000 years, which is a really hard case to make. I mean, the term 1,000 years occurs 6 times in 7 verses. And if you were wanting to say it's going to be a really long period of time, there's other words and even other ways that John expresses that. So I'm not sure why you would ever take any of the numbers in Revelation in any way other than literally. I think 144,000 spelled out as 12,000 from the 12 tribes. I think it was literally 7 churches. And I think the seals and trumpets and bowls are all literal in nature. Okay, another place where Paul describes Satan is in his second letter to the Corinthians. He calls him the God of this world, who has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. I don't know how you can say that Satan is not active and not deceiving the nations in light of what that scripture says. Of course, we're going to get to 1 Peter 5, where Peter says, "Your adversary, the devil, prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." So you've got scriptural support for the fact that Satan is alive and well. You've also got just human history and current events. I mean, Satan does not look like he's bound today. He's very much active, and he's enjoying, I would argue, a great deal of success in deceiving the nations, in bringing about people embracing false religion, and in keeping the nations at war with each other. So it's going to be a complete incapacitation at a future point in time that Satan will be bound, and you can see where that would be a tremendous advantage for the millennial reign of Christ, right? If Satan is bound, then the people that are on the earth at that time, even though you'll have some people that are still in unglorified bodies and will still have to deal with sin that way, you won't have Satan in charge. You won't have him being the God of this world. And that will greatly enhance the ability of people who know the Lord to live righteous lives and to worship the true God. However, at the end of that 1,000-year period, Satan will be released for a short period of time, and we'll deal with that when we get there, 7 through 9. Okay? So that's the first scene in chapter 20. It's actually the 4th scene of the 8th. Now let's move to the 5th scene. My clicker's not working here. There we go. Just had a momentary glimpse.
Right.
All right, sorry.
So, when Satan is bound, are the demons still out on range and still dealing sin, or are they also bound to hell with him as well?
That's a good question, and the simple answer is the Bible doesn't tell us. I think we have to assume that they're not able to have the same kind of power that they have today because their leader is captive. That's right, but it doesn't really tell us what their situation is during that time. Well,
You say with Satan bound in 1,000 years, it's, I guess, easier for people, even unbelievers, to live a more righteous life, or do you think it'll still be the kind of sin there is today?
Yeah.
so there will still be sin during the millennial kingdom. There'll still be death as a result of sin. Isaiah the prophet talks about how though when a man dies at the age of 100, he'll be considered a young man. So we're going to get to this a little bit later as well. There will be enhanced conditions during the millennial kingdom and some pretty significant changes on the earth at that point in time, but sin will only be completely done away with once we get into the eternal state.
It says even the last enemy to be defeated is death.
That's right. So that won't have happened until we get to the eternal state, until we get to the great white throne judgment. Because after God judges everybody else, he throws death and Hades into the lake of fire.
And to Kevin's point there, when you have the presence of the incarnate Son, obviously there was a spike of activity, but the fear was don't bind us over the demonic demons that end up in the pigs and whatnot. So I imagine even if they're free, there's going to be a trepidation because now he's not only present but actively ruling and reigning. And if Satan's bound, then I'd imagine it's a pretty pretty hair trigger to just, you're bound too.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Even if they're not incapacitated the same way that Satan is, they're going to be afraid and they're going to recognize Christ's authority. They already recognize his authority, right? We see that in the epistles. But it's just going to be a very different situation from the way it is now. We talk about Satan being the God of this world. It's a world system that opposes the true God. And in the Millennial Kingdom, you've got Christ on the earth, and you've got the law of God and the knowledge of God all over the world. It's really fascinating when you read the latter prophets. And they're in there a lot, this future period of time where you've got an absolutely perfect monarch. It's not a democracy, by the way. You've got a perfect monarch ruling over the world and dealing with sin justly. You know, we in our country pride ourselves on justice being swift, but it doesn't really work out that way. You have court and lawsuits that take forever to get resolved. Well, in that future period of time, you're going to have not only Christ as judge, but his church ruling and reigning with him, and you'll have justice that's very swift. And it's not to say there won't be sin and there won't be consequences, but it'll be dealt with very swiftly.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
How do we deal with Christ? All right, so we say that Christ is not ruling and reigning now, but he says, "Come sit at my right hand as I make all your enemies a footstool." Well, and then the last of his enemies then being death. So how do we deal with how do we deal with a dispensationalist view in light of like a post-mill view in that regards when we're in that context?
Okay, so post-mills and non-mills would argue that Christ is now sitting on his throne at the right hand of the Father in heaven. And our argument is it's two different thrones. He is at his Father's throne right now, and he has been he's already been given all authority in heaven and on earth, but he doesn't display that authority until he comes back to the earth and reigns from the Davidic throne in Jerusalem.
Wouldn't they make the point though that he wouldn't come back until all his enemies are defeated?
No, I don't think so. Well, I don't know if they would make that point, but I think scripturally it's clear that he doesn't defeat death until he comes back, and that defeat occurs at the end of the millennial reign.
Okay, so you mean like when he comes back, not the first time, but I don't know, the
Second time.
second,
Yes.
the third time really, I guess?
Well, how would he be the third?
Well, so he came in flesh, then he comes at the millennium, and then he doesn't come back until death is defeated. So how do you juggle those kind of those sayings? He says, "Sit at my right hand until I make all your enemies a footstool for your feet."
Okay, now you're talking about Psalm 110, right? When you quote that.
Yes.
And I mean, the idea was even the Davidic kings in the Old Testament were at the right hand of God, and there was that father-son relationship there. And of course, none of them defeated death. They couldn't even righteously rule their own nation.
Correct.
But Christ himself is at the right hand of the Father, and then I understand the question you're asking. It sounds like as you read Psalm 110 that he's going to stay there until death is defeated,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But I think as you continue to read through the scripture, it's clear that he doesn't defeat death until he comes back. And so I think the main point is that he is going to defeat it, but I think it's clear that he doesn't do that until the end of the millennial kingdom, the end of his reign.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm answering that
So
question
death would
correctly.
be probably judged at the Great White Throne Judgment, or right before, after the judgment of the people, and right before the new earth.
That's
and the new heaven.
that's exactly where it happens. That's where death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire.
So, I think maybe the point of tension you have in Hebrews, also quoting Psalm 110, Hebrews 2, and he finishes in verse 8, "You've put all things in subjection under your feet. From subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to him." I think the tension is, how are all things subjected when they're not actively subjected? And I think that's the point of tension. Does he rule or does he not? Does he reign or does he not? Are they subjected or are they not? So I think that's the point of tension, is how does it partially work out then completely work out?
Yeah, I do think it's important. We read this back in Revelation chapter 3 to recognize that you've got the throne of the Father and the throne of the Son. Right now, he's at the right hand of the Father, and he's on his Father's throne. And the promise to the overcomer in chapter 3 is, chapter 3, verse 21, this is to the message of the church in Laodicea. He who overcomes, I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne. And where is that throne? It's in Jerusalem. It's the Davidic throne that's been there since Old Testament times, that's in suspension right now. I mean, there's nobody sitting on that throne today. There's no king over Israel, hasn't been for a long time. But that's the throne that's even prophesied to Mary, right? It's her son is going to be giving the throne of her father David, of his father David, sorry. So I'll grant to him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also came and sat down with my Father on his throne. So in both cases, when the overcomer sits with Christ on his throne, he's ruling. The overcomer as well as Christ are both ruling over the earth. And in the same way now, you've got the Son sitting with the Father on his throne, and he does have authority, and he does rule. I mean, you get into the mystery of the Trinity at that point. But the full revelation and exercise of his authority doesn't come until he comes back and rules over the earth. Does that help? Okay. So let's keep going. What do we get to here? So this fifth scene consists of the millennial reign of Christ upon the earth and the final doom of Satan. Now, as we read about this millennial reign in Revelation 20, we're not really given much information about the character of the kingdom, right? The main emphasis, and again it's said 6 times in 7 verses, is that the kingdom lasts for 1,000 years. Why do you think we're not told more about what the kingdom's like?
Because we're told in the Old Testament.
Exactly. We're given all kinds of information about the kingdom in the Old Testament. John he's assuming really that you're familiar with the Old Testament. I mean, over half of his book has allusions back to the Old Testament. You think about the book of Revelation. It's the only book in the Bible that has everything else in the Bible as previous context. So the Old Testament is full of references that speak about this future coming kingdom. And that's why I think it's clear as you read those prophecies that it hasn't happened yet, right? Israel has not been in peace in her land in a long time. She's not embraced the Messiah yet. The kind of absence of warfare that we read about in the Old Testament prophets certainly hasn't happened in the course of human history. It would be ideal if we were all really familiar with all that's in the Old Testament, the latter prophets especially, about the nature of the kingdom. I know that's not the case, and we're not going to try to read through all of them this morning, but I am going to read a couple of key passages that give us a taste of what this future kingdom is like. This is another one of those motivating factors for reading through the whole Bible over the course of a year. If you want to just read through the Old Testament over the course of the year, make that a goal, because you'll see things in doing that you can't see in any other way. But I want to read a couple of passages out of the prophet Isaiah and make a few comments about them. The first is Isaiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 2. It will come about that in the last days, and that's a frequent phrase in the Old Testament that speaks of the end of history in this present heavens and earth, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. Now, the temple already sits on a series of 3 hills in the city of Jerusalem. I think it's that even that hill that it sits on is going to be raised, and there are going to be other topographical changes that we can read about in the prophets. It will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Now, again, this is not just Israel. God's plan from the very beginning was that Israel will be set apart as a people to draw all the other nations to himself. That hasn't happened yet in history, either biblical history or more recent history. But at this point in time, all the nations will come to Jerusalem. And we saw this even with the sacrifices that we looked at last week, that they all come and participate in that. And if they don't come, they don't get rain on their land. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob." He's talking about the temple there. "That he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths." Now, that's just fascinating to me. You're talking about people from all over the world wanting to come to Jerusalem to be taught the ways of God. It's incredible. "For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Now, let's say that you were a person living in the days of Isaiah the prophet, and you heard that sentence. The law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. The law there is the same word, Torah, that we use for the first 5 books of the Bible. What is he saying there? What law?
Sacrificial law.
Which law? Sacrificial?
The Mosaic.
Okay, I think it includes both of those. I think, again, Torah is the law as the way that we would normally think about it, the first 5 books of the Bible, but especially the Mosaic law in Exodus 19 through 24. So that's why it makes sense. As you read the prophets, you read a section like Ezekiel 40 through 48, you've got the same things that are spelled out by the law. You've got designated order of priests, animal sacrifices, temple worship, the temple itself. All that comes from the original law. And so oftentimes all mills and post mills will critique dispensationalists because they'll say, well, this is a retrogression. You're going back to a system that was done away with by Christ and by his sacrifice. And I understand that argument to some degree. The New Testament talks a lot about the fact that the church is not under the law, but not that the law has been completely done away with. And it comes back. It comes back with a perfect king leading the people and keeping the law, just as the original kings were supposed to do. He will judge between the nations. He'll render decisions for many peoples. They'll hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Again, you're talking about the elimination of warfare at that point, and even the changing of the tools of war into something that can be used to reap the productivity of the land. Nation will not lift up sword against nation. Never again will they learn war. Look, there's another section in Isaiah chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse. Jesse, of course, being, who is Jesse?
David's
David, that's right. Father of David, of the tribe of Judah. A branch from his roots will bear fruit. And this kind of language is used throughout the prophets, this shoot or branch of David. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. It's perfect qualifications for a king, for a leader. He will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. So this is talking about the character of the king himself. He'll strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. We saw that back in Revelation chapter 19. And with the breath of his lips, he will slay the wicked. Also, righteousness will be the belt about his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. So that's a section, those verses, again, just describing the character of the king. As we get to verse 6, I want you to listen carefully to what's described here, and you tell me what the significance of this is. It's a pretty significant change from verse 5. The wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little boy will lead them. That is, lead all of those, I suppose. The wolf, the leopard, the calf, the young lion, the fatling. Also the cow and the bear will graze. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. And the nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. What's going on there? What's the purpose?
Like peace.
Jeez. New heaven and earth.
Oh,
the we're talking about how there will be absolute no sin and everything will go back to the former creation.
Okay, so I agree that is what the new heavens and new earth talk about. I don't think that's what's being described here. I think this is conditions during the millennial kingdom. And this is actually a partial reversal of the curse and the enmity between animals. And even between, it talks about a young child playing by the holy cobra. Nobody would allow their child to do that today because of the danger. But at this point in time, during the millennial kingdom, you've got a reversal, at least partial reversal, not complete reversal of the curse, because you still have death, but it's a very different kind of situation. And again, it does go back to the way it was before the fall in the Garden of Eden. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now, again, at this point, everybody will know about the Lord, and many people will know the Lord. There's a difference between those two things. It becomes clear at the end that not everybody knows the Lord, right? Because there is a final rebellion at the end of the 1,000 years. But it's a complete knowledge of the Lord over the earth like we've never seen before in history, and certainly different from today. Okay. As John continues to describe his vision, he says in verse 4 that he saw thrones and they sat upon them, and judgment was given to them. Who is the they there that sits upon the thrones?
The raised in Christ.
Okay, good. Who is that more specifically at this point in time?
I mean, it would be us, right?
Exactly. It's the church. That's the nearest plural antecedent is the armies of God that are mentioned in 1919 and 1914. And these are previously resurrected saints who return with Christ to the earth and co-reign with him. Now again, this is in accordance with the earlier promises in the book of Revelation, as well as with what the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians. Remember, I think we read this not too long ago. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:2, do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is judged by you, are you not competent to constitute the smallest law courts? Do you not know that we shall judge angels? And again, this is at this future period of time where we're in glorified bodies. How much more matters of this life? Now, I think we hear the term judge, we usually think of judges that we're familiar with, right? Somebody in a black robe in a courtroom, listening to evidence, making a decision between evidence and witnesses. I think the idea of judging here certainly includes making decisions where they have to between something that's righteous and unrighteous. But I think it's more leading to reigning with Christ, ruling over the nations. And I think that'll become more clear as we read some of these other references.
Right.
Yes?
If people who believe the Amil system think that this stuff is happening right now, what do they think about that in 1 Corinthians when it's speaking future tense, that this will happen? Like what would they, do you know what they would say?
It's a really
about
good
that?
question.
I can kind of
Okay.
well, I guess not really an on-mill perspective, but more of a post-mill, so I guess it doesn't help.
Well,
No, but that's fine, because if you believe that we're in the millennium right now, then why would Paul say this is going to happen in the future? Because he was in the church age also.
They would just say it's because once he comes back, all things are new and changed. That's the only way they can get out of that.
so that is an important point. They often take things that we would say that are fulfilled in the millennium and they would put them in the eternal state. If you don't have a future millennium, then some of those things just get to the eternal state instead. I guess that's what they would do with that one then, right?
Well, I mean, like I said, I don't know so much the all-mill, but I know the post-mill would just, they're preterists, really. They believe that all the events have already happened. You know what I mean? In light of like a bunch of, not the end, but the Revelation judgments was happened in 70 AD on the temple and everything, and then Satan is bound, and the nation, the gospel can be fruitful through his chosen, and then eventually usher in the kingdom, the eternal kingdom, not 1,000 years.
So would they say that we're ruling with Christ right now?
Not necessarily. Not all postmillennials think that the golden age has started, for instance.
Okay.
So that's one
Would
way.
Amil say that we're ruling with Christ right
Correct.
now?
Yes, in a spiritual sense.
So just why would Paul speak about it in future tense?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think the frustration of getting a good answer to that question is they don't necessarily address that, or at least not in a book. The only way they would address that is if they're working through 1 Corinthians and deal with it as they come across it. It'd be interesting to read somebody who's all mill and just see if they have commentary on 1 Corinthians and get it from there. I don't think a passage like that will come up in the meaning of the Millennium. I don't know why.
Maybe they don't see 1 Corinthians as talking about this same thing. I don't know. I'm gonna think about that.
Yeah.
Well, I know, but I don't know.
A simple answer is that there was a lot of transition going on. I don't know if this is how you would answer, but I'm going to try to, do my best and honor, they're smart people. A lot of transition going on, and the church is sort of getting it together, and we're going to judge. We're going to be judging angels. This is what our role is now in this realm. Again, I don't know, but that would be how, if I were of that position, I think that's how I would answer it.
And you can see where, even though they would see it as this church age, I think it's the same thing Matt's saying, is that there'd be progress through that, and you'd get a point later down the road where you could do that.
Okay. That makes sense.
It makes sense. It don't make complete sense to me because I'm looking at it from a different perspective. I don't know anybody that's leading angels today, and I don't expect them to until Christ comes back.
I mean, the judgment is it more of the testimony of our lifestyle is a judgment unto them and how they should have been, or is it an actual, he stands before a judgment and then we say, I don't know.
So you're limiting at that point the judgment of angels to the bad angels, right?
Well, I guess,
Because the other ones didn't fall, and they wouldn't have any
are we
reason.
judging fallen and non-fallen alike, elect angels and non-elect alike?
Well, that's the question. I mean, it seems to me that, particularly in Hebrews 2, that David pointed out earlier, was that the argument that's being made there is the world is going to be subject to Christ as a man. And we also, as men, male and female, are going to judge and rule the whole world because Christ is a man. And it was given to man, even back to Adam originally, to rule over the world, not to angels. So he's making an argument for the superiority of Christ to what has come before, but he's also making that argument that Christ is superior because he's a man, and even superior to angels, that he's already talked about in chapter 1. So I would take it, I'm not saying that you couldn't take it as just fallen angels, but I would take this as all angels, and the fact that we're going to rule the world as humans, glorified humans, eventually, rather than angels doing it.
Is it we rule the universe then, basically?
Well, the earth at least.
What about?
I think God still takes the care of the universe.
Well, I don't mean like all of reality. I just mean the vastness of it, really.
Well, again, I would go back to the creation account and charge for us to be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth and rule over it. So we do that in the end. I just don't think we have. I guess I see your point now, because angels are not part of that earth in that sense. Yeah. It's a strange thing to me. It is difficult. It's a difficult thing to see in what sense we rule over angels as spirit beings. I mean, humanity has never done that in the past, but that's the statement here.
Will they be physically present? Is there any indication that they'll be?
I think they're definitely involved in gathering of the elect at the end of the tribulation period, but I don't know that I don't know that they would or would not be present during the Millennial Kingdom, at least in human form. Obviously, they'd still be present in some sense. Okay, let me just read you a couple more verses that talk about the fact that we rule with Christ on the earth. A couple of these are promises to the overcomers. We already read Revelation 3:21. Let me read you one in Revelation chapter 2. He who overcomes and who keeps my deeds until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. Again, he's talking there not about Christ, but the overcomer that's with Christ. As the vessels of the potter are broken to pieces, and as I also have received authority from my Father. And then in the song, the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures in Revelation 5, they sang a new song saying, "Worthy art thou to take the book and to break its seals." They are talking about Christ there. "For thou wast slain and didst purchase for God with thy blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. Thou hast made them to be a king and priest to our God, and they will reign upon the earth." So again, I think it's an argument against it being a reign that takes place in heaven. That's the way that some understand the 1,000-year reign. This is a reign that's on the earth. It only takes place after Christ comes back to the earth. So that's one group that reigns with Christ. A second group described here in Revelation 20 is those who have been beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the Word of God, even those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark upon their forehead and upon their hand. These are saints that died during the tribulation period, during the 7 years that we read about in the book of Revelation. And they died because of their faithfulness to the true Christ as opposed to the false Christ. They also are raised and rule with Christ for 1,000 years. There's a third group, and they're not mentioned here in Revelation 20, but if we go back to the prophet Daniel, we see a group that's basically the Old Testament saints. So Daniel 12, 1 and 2. "At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people," he's talking about Israel here, "will arise. There will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." It makes sense, right? That the Old Testament saints would be raised at the end of the tribulation period, but before the Millennial Kingdom, so that they can participate in that reign that's described throughout the latter prophets. Now it says the rest of the dead are not raised until the 1,000 years are over. So it's distinguishing those that are mentioned earlier in Revelation 20 with the rest of the dead that will get raised, but they get raised after the 1,000 years. And it's really important to read verse 5 properly. The first part of verse 5 says, "The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed." And then it says, "This is the first resurrection." So it's not saying that the rest of the dead that are raised 1,000 years later are part of the first resurrection. That first part you have to read as parenthetical. He's kind of making an aside comment that the rest of the dead don't get raised till the end of the 1,000 years. And then he's going back and saying the ones that were raised earlier are part of the first resurrection. Does that make sense? Okay. So I want to look at that a little more closely just to understand these two different kinds of resurrection. The first resurrection and then the one that occurs at the end of the 1,000 years. The first resurrection and the promise of blessing to those who are part of it actually has several stages, right? What's the very first stage of the first resurrection?
Christ.
Right. It's the resurrection of Christ himself. He was the first fruits, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, and that concept being he was the first one to be raised in a series of others that will come later. Here's what Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15. "But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. For since by a man came death, by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all shall be made alive. But each in his own order." And now he's going to kind of lay out the order, some of these different aspects of this first resurrection. Christ the first fruits. After that, those who are Christ at his coming. Now, I know Matt's done some particular study on this and wrote a paper in seminary about it. I'm going to ask him, put him on the spot here. I think you could argue that the group he's talking about here are actually raptured saints at the beginning of Christ's return to the earth, and these tribulation saints that are raised at the end of it. Because if you look at that, at Christ's coming as that whole complex of events over the course of those 7 years, both of those would be those at Christ's coming. Would you agree with that, or did you see that differently when you wrote the paper?
Yeah, because the only other one is the end, which happens after he reigns. So.
Right. So that you would put the resurrection of the rest of the dead at that point, right?
Correct.
Okay. So does that make sense? You've got Christ as the first fruits. Those that are his at his coming would include both church saints before the tribulation period and tribulation saints at the end of the 7 years. All of those are Christ's. And they're really all part of his coming, because that whole 7 years is his coming. His parousia is the Greek term.
Something that just kind of struck me, I've never really taken mind of before, but you said that first was Christ, and that was 2,000 years ago, which is what we're pointing to currently. And then he says, and those asleep in Christ. Well, if they're a good defense for, your worldview or your eschatology would be saying, okay, well, if their Amil is thrown out, because if he's reigning now, then they would be resurrected with Christ spiritually, and then they would come back. So if they're asleep, then how does their defense stand up to them being currently asleep, only to be resurrected later? Does that make sense?
Well, when he says asleep, he means dead, right? Physically dead. And so the Amils are going to put the physical resurrection at the end of this age, the church age. So I think the way they would do it is they've been raised with Christ and seated with him in the heavenly places, the way Paul says it in Ephesians. But their bodily resurrection doesn't occur until the end of the age.
But don't Amils believe that resurrection happens as soon as you're dead? You're raised with Christ.
Spiritually, yes, but not physically.
That's what I was pointing to, but we're actually asleep until we're resurrected when he comes back.
But they would say that's physical death, and that physical resurrection doesn't occur until he comes back.
So they have a spiritual, and then they have a physical.
That's right. That's exactly what they do in Revelation 20.
Well, that's the only way they can defend their word.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Whereas we would say we were asleep until we were bodily resurrected. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So, to be absent from the body is present with the Lord. Our souls are with Christ after we die, but we're described as being asleep because it's a temporary condition for our body. We end up being raised from the dead bodily.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got Christ as the first fruits. We've got 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17 talks about church saints that are raptured, we believe, before the tribulation period. The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ shall rise first. That's bodily. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. So there will be a group of people that are alive on the earth when Christ comes for his church, and they're not resurrected because they haven't died, but their bodies are changed, and they get glorified bodies that are fit to live first in heaven and then in the eternal state. So then you've got the 7-year tribulation and the revelation, and at the end of that period of time, you've got the resurrection of both the tribulation saints that died during those 7 years and the Old Testament saints that died in the Old Testament. So all of these are part of the first resurrection. All of them will be participants in the millennial kingdom for 1,000 years. And then John distinguishes those from the rest of the dead that are raised at the end of the 1,000 years. Now, we've already read Daniel 12 that talks about two different kinds of resurrections, right? One was a resurrection to everlasting life, another to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Can you think of another place where it talks about two different kinds of resurrections similar to that? New Testament? John 5, Jesus speaking. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tomb shall hear his voice, and shall come forth. Those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. Now granted, when you read it that way, it sounds like it all happens at the same time. All Revelation 20 does is tell you that there's 1,000 years between those two resurrections. Bless you.
I have a question, one more question about the resurrection. So when, let's say it happens tomorrow, just to, for sake of argument, we would be transitioned immediately into our resurrected bodies, and then for our glorified bodies rather, does death have a hold of us?
Not at that point.
But the other people that are left obviously have this amazing revelation that, Christ is real, this is happening, and the ones that do convert, they're the ones that, still face death and still, the lion eats with the lamb. That young man will die in 100 years is talking about them, not necessarily the church that is changed into glorified body. Right?
Okay, so now the lion with the lamb, that's in the millennial kingdom, and we're back here at that point in time. But the people that are subject to death over the course of the 7 years who embrace the gospel, yes, they're still subject to die physically until they're glorified.
And then and it also says that we would be preachers to those people.
Not us, because we're up in heaven with Christ during that time. But the 144,000 that he saved out of the nation of Israel, I believe, are missionary preachers.
I'm sorry, it's just so much,
No problem.
So, during the church age, when you said that we wouldn't be resurrected to heaven, but it would be like we would be given glorified bodies, would that mean that we're not yet in a perfect stage, but we're close to being a perfect stage? Or
No, I'm just making a distinction. So you've got people that have died during the church age, and they're raised from the dead when Christ comes back.
Oh.
But you got some Christians that are still on the earth that haven't died yet. They're the ones that, you can't really call it resurrection, right? Because they haven't died.
They haven't died.
But they get glorified bodies just like the ones that were raised from the dead. And we are perfect at that point. We don't have sin, indwelling sin the way that we do now. And we're all caught up to be with the Lord in the air and living in heaven for 7 years.
We do face judgment after the white throne judgment.
Not the white throne judgment. We get our judgment while we're in heaven at the bema seat of Christ. Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians 5. The white throne judgment is for a different group of folks. We're going to get there, especially next week.
So that would mean that we're being judged for the things that we've done instead of what we've sinned against.
Exactly right. 2 Corinthians 5:10, we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ in order that we might be judged for the deeds of the body, whether good or bad. I understand that to mean after we become believers and not for our sin, just as you said. So we'll talk about judgments next week, because in the same way that you have this series of resurrections, we would see that there's a series of judgment also.
That's what I'm thinking.
That's right. And again, this is a key difference between dispensationalist, covenantal, or amill, premill. We see some distinctions at different points. They would put the resurrection all at one point, and they would put Christ coming all at one point, not separated by 7 years of tribulation, rapture, and second coming. Okay, you guys are being very patient. I'll keep going here. This is the last part of this is Satan's doom in verses 7 through 10. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be released, it says, for a short period of time, just as it said earlier in verse 3. He had been confined in order that he might not deceive the nations. When he's released, that's exactly what he sets out to do. And think about this. Despite the fact that you've had 1,000 years led by a perfect ruler and king, swift justice, prosperity, just a tremendous environment, not completely free of sin, so not exactly like before the fall, but very similar. And yet, at the end of this period of time, Satan is able to amass not just a small group of people, but it says it's like the armies or like the sands of the seashore. It's a huge rebellion. Now, granted, the nations have basically been repopulated over that 1,000-year period because they were destroyed during the tribulation period. So I think the only thing that we can conclude is that there's been an outward conformity by many people, particularly at the end, to the law of God, but not an inner commitment, not a change of heart. And so Satan is able to lead those people astray, just as he always have done, in one final rebellion against Christ. This army comes up against the beloved city, which would be the city of Jerusalem. We read about that this morning. Both Psalms 78 and 87 describe that city as the beloved city. But there's no long battle, there's no protracted warfare, there's no need for the nations or the people that are on the side of right to participate in war. Remember, they've not been trained for war now, because fire comes down out of heaven and quickly devours these enemies of God. And then following this final rebellion, Satan himself meets his final doom. He's cast into the lake of fire, where both the false prophet and the false Christ have already spent 1,000 years, because they were thrown in there before the millennium began. The torment of all three of these, Satan, the false Christ, and the false prophet, will be continuous and everlasting. So that's scenes 4 and 5. Next week we'll look at the Great White Throne Judgment. It's a shorter passage, but we'll look at the series of judgments that we've been talking about too. The famous seat of Christ and the judgment, the sheep and goats judgment that's described in Matthew 25, as well as the Great White Throne Judgment here in Revelation 20. You guys have done a really good job just asking questions along the way. If there are any other questions before? Okay.
So in 5, where it says the rest are dead, they didn't come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. Does that mean that those who are dead and dead in their sins, does that mean that they would be on the army with Satan, or would they still be dead as in physically dead?
Okay, so the rest of the dead are those that have already died before the millennium, and they're resurrected at the end of the 1,000 years for the Great White Throne Judgment. So there's another question that kind of goes along with what you're asking. What about people that died during the millennium?
That's what I've asked. Like people that have died and that have been sentenced to hell right before the Great White Judgment, will they be like resurrected for that final army, for that final war?
No.
Will they be brought back?
No, they won't be resurrected to participate in the war. That'll just be people that are alive during the 1,000-year period. But at the end of the 1,000 years, everybody who hasn't been resurrected up to that point will be resurrected then, and they'll be judged according to whether their names are written in the book of life.
Because I would have thought in that 1,000-year period where God reigned over the earth, there would have been a lot more people that came to Christ and knew them, which would make his army a lot smaller.
Yeah, it does seem that way. I think that's a fair observation. To me, it's just surprising that many participate in that final rebellion. It's hard to know how many don't, but it does say that there's the ones who do are like the sand of the seashore. There's a lot of people, and they come from the four corners of the earth, not just one place. But there's no resurrection of the unrighteous to participate in that.
And we're talking about 1,000 years of, populating the earth with no curse.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
that's a huge amount of people.
It is.
I mean, it's still don't get me wrong. There's death, but I mean, I'm talking about the.
It's been a
you
reversal.
lived for 300 years. I've been married for 10. I have 4 kids. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right.
That I can't imagine.
That's exactly right. It is going to be a long period of time, a lot of fruitfulness, and again, that goes all the way back to the original command to man and back in Genesis. And people will live a lot longer period of time. So you're right. You can still have a great mass of people that were believing, but you also have a great mass that are part of this rebellion. Good questions. Really good discussion. Let's close our time in prayer together, and we will be dismissed. Father, we thank you for this section of Revelation, particularly beginning in 1911 with the return of Christ. It's something that we look forward to with great anticipation. We just thank you for the revelation that you've given us to help understand the end of the story. We recognize that you've already redeemed us in Christ, and you've already even ordained our steps, as it were, and ordained our deeds. And yet we still have responsibility to live faithfully for Christ until he comes. So we want to do that. We want to do that by the way that we love each other as fellow members of the body, by the way that we love people outside of the body, so that we might be faithful witnesses of Christ, but always thinking about and being motivated by his return, recognizing that even we will stand before the judgment seat of Christ, but not condemned for our sin. So we thank you for what you've done in our lives already, and we pray that you would continue to strengthen and sanctify us in your truth, and just help us as we go from here and go to the different places that you have us through the week, to live faithfully for you, to honor you, and to be strong witnesses for Christ in that way. We pray in his name. Amen.